What if I told you that everything you've learned about what God looks like might have been a carefully constructed lie? What if the image you've carried in your mind since childhood, the one you were taught was the true face of the divine, was actually the result of centuries of cultural and political manipulation? This question may sound disturbing, but that's exactly what we need to investigate today. Think about it. When you close your eyes and imagine God, Jesus Christ, or any sacred figure of Christianity, what image comes to mind? If you're like most people in the Western world, you probably picture a man with fair skin, long, straight hair, and blue or light brown eyes. This image is so deeply ingrained in our culture that questioning it seems almost blasphemous. But what if I showed you that this representation might be completely wrong? What I am about to reveal will challenge not only your visual beliefs, but your entire understanding of the relationship between race, power, and religion. We will explore historical, archaeological, and even biblical evidence that suggests something revolutionary, that the God we worship, the Christ we venerate, may always have had characteristics that have been systematically erased from our collective consciousness. Imagine the psychological impact of this. Black children growing up never seeing themselves reflected in the divine presented to them. Imagine entire generations conditioned to associate holiness, purity, and divine power exclusively with European characteristics. This conditioning is not accidental. It is the result of a very specific and intentional historical process. Over the next few minutes, we'll embark on a journey that begins with the earliest Christian representations in Africa and the Middle East, moves through the transformations these images underwent when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, and culminates in their completely modified form today. We'll analyze original biblical texts that depict Jesus in a very different way than we're used to seeing. But this goes far beyond a simple historical correction. We're talking about how the visual representation of the divine shapes our self-esteem, our identity, and even our ability to connect with the sacred. We're talking about how millions of people have been deprived of seeing their own image reflected in what is most sacred and powerful in their beliefs. The question that will guide us today is, if we discovered that God has always had black features, how would that transform not only our understanding of history, but our relationship with spirituality, with social justice, and with ourselves? And more importantly, why has this possibility been so carefully hidden from us? Prepare yourself for a revelation that goes far beyond religion. We will discover how the skin color of a deity can determine the fate of entire civilizations, how art can be used as a tool of domination, and how recovering these lost truths can be the key to a more authentic and liberating spirituality. What you are about to discover is not just history. It is a revelation that could transform how you see the world, your faith, and yourself. And perhaps, just perhaps, this is exactly the revelation our society needs to hear right now. Before we continue this transformative journey, I need you to do something important. If this content is already challenging your certainties, if you feel you're about to discover something that will change your perspective, then leave a like now. This shows you're ready to question, to grow, to expand your consciousness. And if you want to continue receiving content that challenges the status quo, that brings truths that many prefer to hide, then subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell, because what comes next will be even more revealing, and you won't want to miss any detail of this discovery that can transform not only your faith, but your entire life. The simple yet profoundly disturbing question, why do all the churches, museums, and Christian books you've ever seen depict Jesus Christ with European features? This isn't just an artistic curiosity. It's the result of one of the greatest historical revision campaigns ever undertaken by humankind, and its consequences shape our society to this day. When we analyze the earliest Christian representations, we find something fascinating. In the catacombs of Rome, in the oldest mosaics of early Christianity, in the churches of Ethiopia that remained isolated from European influence for centuries, we see something completely different from what we are used to. We see a black Christ, a black Virgin Mary, saints and prophets with unmistakably African features. This shouldn't surprise us when we consider the geography. Jesus was born in the Middle East, in a region that directly borders Africa. The first Christian communities settled in North Africa, in Egypt, and in Ethiopia. Christianity first flourished among populations that today would be classified as black or mixed race. However, at some point in history, These images were systematically replaced. The process was not accidental. When Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in the 4th century, it initiated a transformation that went far beyond simple religious acceptance. It was necessary for this new official religion of the empire to align itself with the values and aesthetics of the Roman elite. And the Roman elite, of course, was white and viewed Africans as subjugated peoples. But let's go deeper. Why does this matter so much? Why can't we simply accept that different cultures portray the divine according to their own characteristics? The answer lies in power. When you control the image of God, you control who can see themselves as made in God's image. You control who is considered holy, pure, worthy of worship, and consequently, who is considered inferior. Consider the psychological impact of this on a black child. From a young age, they learn that God, Jesus, Mary, all the angels and saints are white. The subliminal message is clear. Divinity has a color, and it's not their color. This doesn't just affect self-esteem, it affects the very capacity for spiritual connection. How can you feel you were made in God's image when God doesn't look anything like you? Now imagine the opposite. Imagine growing up seeing that the very creator of the universe shares your physical characteristics, that the greatest prophets and saints in history look like you and your family. Imagine the empowerment, the confidence, the sense of purpose that this would generate. That is the difference between a spirituality that liberates and one that oppresses. And we're not just talking about individual self-esteem. We're talking about how entire societies organize themselves. When one race is consistently associated with the divine and another is systematically excluded from that association, we create the basis for social hierarchies that persist for centuries. Racism is not just economic or political. It has deeply spiritual roots. Religious art is not neutral. Each painting, each sculpture, each stained glass window tells a story about who belongs to the kingdom of heaven and who does not. And for 500 years, this story has been told in a very specific way. God is white. Therefore, white people are closer to God. But what if this story is wrong? What if we discover that historical, archaeological, and even biblical evidence points to a completely different reality? What if the Christ we venerate always had dark skin, curly hair, and African features that have been carefully erased from our collective memory? This possibility is not only academically interesting, it is revolutionary. Because if it is true, it means that much of what we consider spiritual truth has been built on a racial lie. It means that millions of people have been deprived of an authentic connection with the sacred, and it means that we have the opportunity to correct one of the greatest injustices in human history. The mystery we are investigating today is not just about the skin color of a historical figure. It's about how the manipulation of that image shaped wars, justified slavery, fueled genocides, and continues to influence how we see ourselves and how we see each other. It's about how recovering that truth can be the first step towards a truly liberating spirituality. We live in extremely difficult times in which prophecies are marked, but many still do not realize what is happening in the world. For this, I have made my ebook available, To Reveal the Apocalypse, which you can download immediately through the first set of comments. This book will help you uncover all the mysteries of the apocalypse and transform your life. Go to the first set of comments to get your copy, as very little remains and will be removed soon. Don't waste time. Click now and secure your digital copy. And don't forget to get your Reveal the Apocalypse ebook. It is very important that you buy it quickly before the copies run out. If you feel your certainties are being shaken, that everything you thought you knew is being questioned, then you're on the right track. Because the truth is rarely comfortable, but it's always liberating. And the truth we're discovering today may be one of the most liberating in human history. Leave the word revelation in the comments if you're ready to discover even more compelling evidence than we're about to reveal. Now let's get to what many consider the most shocking evidence, what the Bible itself tells us about the appearance of Christ and other sacred figures. Prepare yourself, because what you are about to discover may shake everything you thought you knew about the scriptures you've been reading for years. Let's begin with a passage that most people have never noticed, but it is absolutely revealing. In the book of Revelation, chapter 1, verses 14 and 15, John describes his vision of the glorified Christ. His head and hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like burnished bronze refined in a furnace. Most Portuguese translations soften this description, but when we return to the original Greek text, we find something fascinating. The word used to describe Christ's feet is chalcolibanon, which specifically refers to burnt bronze or fire-refined brass, a color that anyone of the time would recognize as very dark brown, almost black. This is not a modern interpretation. It is an accurate description that any ancient metallurgist would perfectly understand. But that's not all. The description of the hair as woolly is also significant. The Greek word arion used here refers specifically to the texture of unprocessed sheep's wool, which is naturally curly and voluminous. This is not the description of smooth, silky hair that we see in European paintings. It is a description of hair with a typically African texture. And there's more. Daniel, chapter 7, verse 9, gives us another revealing description of the Ancient of Days, a figure that many theologians identify as a manifestation of God the Father. I kept looking until thrones were set in place and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. Again, the texture of wool is used to describe divine hair. Now let's look at even more specific evidence. In the Book of Lamentations, chapter 4, verse 8, we find a description that has been systematically mistranslated or ignored. Now their appearance is darker than soot. They are not recognized in the streets. Their skin has stuck to their bones. It has dried up. It has become like wood. The text is speaking of the Nazirites, men consecrated to God, and describes how they looked during a period of deprivation. But the important thing is that the text assumes that the normal appearance of these holy people was dark. But perhaps the most striking evidence comes from an unexpected source: geography and history itself. Jesus was Jewish, born in Palestine. But the Jews of Christ's time were not the Ashkenazi Jews with European features that we know today. They were Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews, with pronounced Semitic characteristics. Moreover, the region of Palestine was under constant influence and migration from African populations. Let's examine a fascinating piece of archaeological evidence. In 1996, archaeologists discovered a 3rd century synagogue in northern Israel with extraordinarily well-preserved mosaics. Among the representations found, there is a figure identified by experts as David, the king of Israel. And what does this figure look like? Curly hair, dark skin, unmistakably African features. This is not speculation. It is concrete archaeological evidence. And there is a biblical passage that is even more revealing, but which is rarely discussed. In the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 13, verse 1, we have the list of prophets and teachers of the church in Antioch. Now in the church at Antioch there were prophets and teachers: Barnabas, Simeon called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. Note the detail: Simeon is called Niger, which in Latin literally means black. It's not a nickname. It's a physical description so obvious that it became part of his name. Lucius is described as a Cyrenean, that is, from Cyrene, a city in what is now Libya in North Africa. These were not occasional visitors. They were leaders of the early church. The original Christian leadership had a strong African presence, but perhaps the most disturbing evidence lies in what has been left out. Have you ever wondered why the Bible specifically mentions when someone is from a particular region, but rarely describes physical appearance? It's because for the original writers, the standard appearance of people in that region was dark-skinned. They only mentioned it when someone had features different from what was expected. And here's the most shocking thing: this evidence has always been there. It wasn't discovered yesterday by some modern political movement. It's in the scriptures that billions of people have been reading for centuries. The question isn't whether the evidence exists. The question is why it has been systematically ignored, mistranslated, or reinterpreted. This leads us to a disturbing question. If these descriptions are so clear, why are our visual representations of Christ and other biblical figures so different? Why have centuries of Christian art ignored these explicit biblical descriptions? The answer lies in the next section, but I can tell you now, it wasn't an accident. Comment: evidence. If you are impressed by what the scriptures themselves reveal and want to know how these truths have been systematically hidden from us. What we have just discovered is not just ancient history. It is a reality that profoundly shapes the world we live in today. And the consequences of this historical manipulation are far more devastating than most people imagine. Let's understand how the whitewashing of the divine continues to affect millions of lives right now. Imagine a 5-year-old black child entering a church for the first time. She looks at the stained glass window and sees a white Jesus. She looks at the statues and sees a white Mary. She looks at the paintings and sees all the angels as white. This child is receiving a powerful subliminal message. God doesn't look like her. Holiness has a specific color, and it's not hers. Now multiply that experience by millions of children over hundreds of years around the entire world. You have one of the largest psychological conditioning operations in human history, and the effects are measurable, documented, and absolutely devastating. Studies in social psychology consistently show that children exposed only to white divine representations develop lower self-esteem, a weaker sense of spiritual purpose, and a greater likelihood of internalizing feelings of racial inferiority. It's not just correlation, it's direct causation. The image of God we absorb in childhood becomes the standard by which we measure our own worthiness. But let's go beyond the children. Let's talk about the adults who, for decades, were taught that humility, submission, and acceptance of one's own inferiority were Christian virtues. Is it a coincidence that these virtues were especially emphasized when preached to black populations? Or is there a direct connection between a white God and the expectation that black people accept subordinate positions in society? The connection becomes even clearer when we analyze how Christianity was used to justify slavery. Literal white preachers quoted scripture to argue that God had destined Africans for servitude. But how would this argument be possible if Jesus Christ were universally recognized as having an African appearance? The answer is that it wouldn't. The whitening of Christ was a necessary precondition for the Christianization of slavery. And this didn't stop with slavery. During apartheid in South Africa, Christian churches were segregated, with the theological justification that each race should worship separately. But again, how would that be possible if Christ were recognized as black? How do you justify racial segregation when the very God you worship belongs to the race you are oppressing? The answer to these questions leads us to a disturbing conclusion. The whitening of Christ was not an artistic accident or an innocent cultural preference. It was a deliberate political strategy to facilitate and justify racial domination. You cannot easily oppress a people when that people shares physical characteristics with the God you claim to worship. But let's get to the present. Today, in 2024, we still see the effects of this manipulation. Research shows that when black American children are asked to draw God, they overwhelmingly draw him white. Even in families that strive to teach racial pride, the cultural influence is so strong that it surpasses family education. And we're not just talking about individual self-esteem. We're talking about how this affects entire social movements. When leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. began speaking about social justice using Christian language, they faced a huge psychological barrier. How do you convince people that God cares about the rights of black people when God is consistently portrayed as white? King's genius lay in beginning to use rhetoric that rehumanized Christ as a defender of the oppressed, regardless of race. But imagine if he could have gone further. Imagine if he could have said, God not only cares about our struggle, God looks like us. Christ not only understands our pain, Christ shares our likeness. This is not speculation. In African countries where Christianity developed independently of European influence, such as Ethiopia, we find a spiritual self-confidence, a sense of divine dignity that is remarkably different from African American Christianity, influenced by European iconography. And now we are living through a time of awakening. Around the world, communities are beginning to question these representations. Churches are starting to include religious art that reflects the real diversity of their congregations. Artists are creating new representations of Christ that honor the historical evidence we have discovered. But the resistance is fierce, because recognizing a black Christ is not just a matter of historical accuracy, it's a matter of power. It's acknowledging that the spiritual basis for white supremacy is fundamentally false. It's admitting that generations of oppression have been justified by a lie. And this resistance comes not only from explicit racists, but from well-intentioned people who simply cannot imagine a spirituality different from the one they have known all their lives. For them, questioning the whiteness of Christ is questioning Christ himself. But in reality, it is the opposite. It is honoring the true Christ, the historical Christ, the Christ who has been systematically distorted to serve political agendas. What is at stake here is not merely historical correction. It is the possibility of a truly liberating spirituality for billions of people. It is the chance to undo one of the greatest injustices in human history. And it is the opportunity to build a future where the image of God reflects all the diversity of humanity that was supposedly created in His image. Leave a comment saying, "Awaken," if you're starting to understand how this revelation can transform not only our understanding of the past, but our actions in the present. Now that we understand the contemporary impact of this issue, it's time to delve into the concrete evidence that supports everything we're discussing. And be prepared, because what history, archaeology, and even science show us is even more compelling than you might imagine. Let's begin with a little-known piece of evidence: the earliest Christian icons found in the monastery of St. Catherine in Egypt. This monastery, isolated in the Sinai Desert for over 1400 years, preserved early Christian art that escaped the iconoclastic destruction that swept through the Byzantine Empire. And what do we find there? Representations of Christ with dark, curly hair, brown skin, and clearly Semitic and African features. These are not modern, Africanized icons. They are the oldest surviving Christian representations to date. Even more fascinating is the famous 6th century icon of Christ Pantocrator, also from the monastery of St. Catherine. Recent technical analyses have revealed that beneath layers of later repainting, the original image depicted a Christ with much darker features than the version we know today. Centuries of restorations have gradually lightened his appearance, literally documenting the process of artistic whitening. But let's get to the most impressive archaeological evidence: Peter's house in Capernaum. Archaeological excavations have revealed not only the remains of the house where Jesus supposedly stayed, but also early Christian graffiti on the walls, dating from the 1st and 2nd centuries. Among these inscriptions are rudimentary representations of human figures that, according to archaeologists, represent Jesus and his disciples. And what do these figures look like? Curly hair, wide noses, thick lips, typically African features. Genetic evidence is also revealing. Studies of Mizrahi and Sephardic Jewish populations, who never migrated to Europe and therefore retained genetic characteristics closer to those of 1st century Jews, consistently show traits that we would now classify as Afro-Asian. These Jews have darker skin, curlier hair, and facial features closer to African than European populations. A particularly fascinating study was conducted by British forensic anthropologist Richard Neve, who used skulls found at archaeological sites in 1st century Palestine to reconstruct the likely appearance of a Jewish man from the time of Jesus. The result? A face with dark brown skin, dark curly hair, a broad nose, and thick lips. This scientific reconstruction is absolutely incompatible with any European representation of Christ. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from an unexpected source: the very enemies of early Christianity. Roman writers who criticized Christianity frequently referred disparagingly to Christians as being composed primarily of Ethiopians and Egyptians. The writer Celsus, in the 2nd century, mocked Christians by calling them worshippers of an Ethiopian god. For the Romans of that time, associating Christianity with Africa was a form of insult, which clearly indicates that this association was recognized as factual. Celsus literally wrote, "How can you say that your God is different when he has the same appearance as the Ethiopian gods?" This is not a modern interpretation. It is direct historical evidence that Jesus' contemporaries associated early Christianity with African characteristics. And we have numismatic evidence as well. Coins minted by early Christian kingdoms in East Africa and Nubia consistently show Christian figures, including representations of Christ, with pronounced African features. These coins date from the 4th to the 7th centuries and represent iconographic traditions that developed independently of European influence. But here is evidence that will shock many. Irish illuminated manuscripts from the 7th and 8th centuries, before significant continental artistic influence, also show Christian figures with much darker features than later representations. The famous Book of Kells, for example, contains depictions of Christ with dark, curly hair and brown skin. This suggests that, even at the fringes of Europe, Christian iconographic traditions originally preserved memories of a non-European Christ. The textual evidence is also overwhelming. Syriac, Coptic, and Ethiopian manuscripts from the early centuries of Christianity contain consistent descriptions of Christ and biblical figures that correspond to African features. The Coptic Testament of Isaac, for example, describes Jesus as having hair like pure wool and skin like refined bronze. And there's more. Analyses of pigments in early Christian frescoes show that many representations that appear light today were originally painted in much darker tones. The natural degradation of the organic pigments used, especially browns and ochres, caused these images to naturally lighten over the centuries, creating the illusion that they were always light. Perhaps the most disturbing evidence is documentary. Letters from European missionaries of the 15th and 16th centuries, when they arrived in Ethiopia and encountered Christian traditions that had existed for over 1,000 years independently of European influence, expressed shock and discomfort with the black representations of Christ they found. A Portuguese missionary wrote in 1520, "These Ethiopians represent our Savior with the color of charcoal, which is an offense to Christian eyes." The offense was not theological, it was racial. These missionaries could not accept that legitimate Christian populations, with traditions older than many European churches, viewed Christ as black. All this evidence points to an inescapable conclusion. European representations of Christ are relatively recent historical innovations, not preservations of primitive traditions. The process of whitening was systematic, intentional, and can be traced historically. And this leads us to a crucial question. If the evidence is so clear, why isn't this information widely known? The answer is in the next section, but I can tell you now, it wasn't by accident. Comment, evidence. If this evidence is opening your eyes to a historical reality that has been deliberately hidden from us. Now we come to the most disturbing part of our investigation. Why has all this evidence that we have just analyzed been systematically suppressed, censored, and even destroyed over the centuries? The answer will reveal one of the most successful conspiracies in human history. A conspiracy that involved popes, emperors, artists, and even religious reformers. Let's start with a specific event that changed everything. The Edict of Thessalonica in 380 AD, when Emperor Theodosius I made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. But it wasn't just any Christianity, it was specifically the version of Christianity that aligned with the aesthetic and racial values of the Roman elite. And the Roman elite had a problem: how to transform a religion that originated in Africa and the Middle East into something palatable to European cultural supremacy. The solution was systematic and brutal. It began with the standardization of Christian art. Imperial edicts established specific guidelines for how sacred figures should be represented. Artists who deviated from these guidelines faced persecution, imprisonment, and even execution. I'm not exaggerating. Historical documents exist that detail specific punishments for improper representations of the divine. But the most devastating blow came during the Byzantine iconoclastic period, 726–843 AD. Although officially it was about the destruction of all religious images, in practice it functioned as an opportunity to selectively destroy representations that did not conform to approved aesthetic standards. When iconoclasm ended and religious art was restored, miraculously almost all new images followed European standards. One particularly revealing document is a letter from Pope Gregory III, dated 731 AD, instructing missionaries on appropriate representations for newly converted populations. The letter explicitly forbids images that might confuse the faithful about the heavenly nature of the Savior, a clear euphemism for African representations of Christ. But let's look at specific cases. In 1493, when the Portuguese arrived in the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia, they found churches full of religious art where all the sacred figures were black: Jesus, Mary, the saints, everyone. The response was immediate and violent. Jesuit missionaries, supported by Portuguese military forces, began a systematic campaign of destruction. Father Pedro Paes, leader of the Jesuit mission, wrote in 1603, "We have found in these lands a visual heresy that represents our Savior with the color of Ethiopians. This blasphemy must be eradicated for the salvation of local souls." Note the language. Representing Christ as black was officially classified as heresy and blasphemy. Thousands of paintings, illuminated manuscripts, and sculptures were destroyed. Entire churches were purified.
Ethiopian artists were forced to relearn their art following European models or faced excommunication. This was not an isolated event. It was replicated everywhere European colonialism encountered independent Christian traditions. But the most shocking evidence comes from the Vatican archives themselves. Secret documents, many only released in recent decades, reveal explicit discussions about the need to correct inadequate representations of Christ.
A papal bull from 1537, discovered only in 1978, declares that representations of the Savior that may diminish his divine dignity in the eyes of European faithful should be discouraged. The language is careful, but the message is clear. A black Christ diminishes his divine dignity for Europeans. This is not theology. It is institutionalized racial supremacy. The censorship process didn't stop at art. Biblical manuscripts were corrected. Oral traditions were suppressed. Even archaeological evidence was ignored or reinterpreted. When archaeological discoveries contradicted established European representations, they were simply not publicized. One specific case is emblematic. In 1884, British archaeologists discovered in Egypt a 4th century Christian mosaic depicting Christ with distinctly African features. The mosaic was photographed, catalogued, and disappeared. It vanished from official records. The photographs were lost. It was only rediscovered in 1967, buried in the cellars of the British Museum, without identification. And this happened repeatedly. Art that contradicted the established narrative was systematically hidden, destroyed, or reinterpreted. Archaeologists who insisted on publicizing inconvenient discoveries lost funding, were excluded from future expeditions, or had their careers sabotaged. But perhaps the most sinister aspect of this censorship is how it continues today. Major museums around the world hold in their storage hundreds of early Christian artifacts depicting Christ and biblical figures with African features. But these artifacts are rarely publicly displayed. When they are, they come with explanations that minimize or rationalize their significance. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York has at least 12 early Christian icons with African representations of Christ. How many are on permanent display? 0. All have been under restoration or awaiting proper cataloging for decades. And when academics try to study these pieces, they face enormous bureaucratic obstacles. Permissions are denied, access is restricted, funding is cut. The message is clear. Some truths must remain buried. Censorship also operates through what is not taught. How many seminaries include studies on early African Christian traditions in their curricula? How many Christian art schools teach about Ethiopian or Nubian iconography? The answer is devastatingly simple: almost none. And this is no accident. It is the result of 500 years of systematic suppression. Entire generations of theologians, historians, and artists have been educated in a version of Christian history that deliberately excludes inconvenient evidence. What's most disturbing is discovering that this censorship is self-imposed. Today, there are no more emperors ordering the destruction of inappropriate art. There are no more popes issuing bulls about appropriate representations. Censorship happens because the system has become so well established that it perpetuates itself. Publishers reject books that question traditional representations. Curators avoid controversial exhibitions. Professors don't mention problematic evidence. Everyone participates in censorship without even realizing they are censoring. And the ultimate irony is that this censorship is maintained in the name of the very faith that is being distorted. Sincerely religious people defend European representations of Christ, believing they are defending Christianity, when in reality they are defending a nationalist and racialized version that would have been unrecognizable to the first Christians. The question remains: if the truth is so threatening that it has needed to be censored for 500 years, what power must that truth have? And what would happen if it were finally released? Comment: true. If you are shocked by the level of systemic suppression we have uncovered and want to know how we can break this cycle of censorship, we now come to the heart of the matter. What does it mean spiritually to discover that God may always have had characteristics that have been systematically erased from our collective consciousness? This is not merely a historical or political question. It is a question that goes to the core of our relationship with the sacred and with ourselves. Let's begin with a fundamental reflection. If God created humanity in His image, as Genesis tells us, what image is that? For centuries, we have been conditioned to believe that this image is European, white, with features that represent only a small fraction of human diversity. But what if the truth is exactly the opposite? What if the image of God is much broader, more inclusive, more universal than we have been taught? Christian tradition speaks of the incarnation, the mystery of God becoming human. But what kind of human? If Jesus chose to incarnate in a specific form, with specific characteristics, what message does this send about who is valued, who is loved, who is considered worthy of carrying the divine presence? For centuries, the implicit answer has been that God chose European features, suggesting a divine hierarchy where certain races are closer to celestial perfection. But if we discover that Jesus always had African features, this completely overturns our theological understanding. It means that God chose to incarnate in a form that, by current standards, would be marginalized, racialized, oppressed. This is not only symbolically powerful, it is theologically revolutionary. It means that God is not on the side of the oppressors, but of the oppressed. He is not identified with imperial power, but with the peoples subjugated by that power. The very incarnation becomes an act of racial and political solidarity. Let's delve deeper. In the Christian tradition, Jesus is often called the second Adam, the new progenitor of humanity. If this second Adam has African features, it completely redefines our understanding of who we are as a species. It means that our divine origin, our fundamental dignity, our likeness to God has nothing to do with European skin color. And this has profound implications for spiritual self-esteem. Imagine a spirituality where Black people don't need to transcend their blackness to connect with the divine, where their physical characteristics are not obstacles to holiness, but reflections of God's own appearance. Imagine the psychological, emotional, and spiritual power of that. But let's explore other spiritual traditions. In Hinduism, Krishna, one of the most revered manifestations of the divine, is consistently depicted with dark blue skin. The name Krishna literally means dark or black in Sanskrit, and this darkness is not seen as a defect or accident. It is celebrated as an expression of divine depth and mystery. In Tibetan Buddhism, many of the most powerful and compassionate deities are depicted with dark skin. Manjushri, the bodhisattva of wisdom, is often depicted as black. Green Tara, the feminine manifestation of compassion, has dark green skin. For these traditions, darkness is associated with spiritual depth, not inferiority. In Islam, although visual representations are discouraged, textual descriptions of the Prophet Muhammad frequently mention his reddish or dark brown skin, and this is considered beautiful, noble, worthy of veneration. The question that arises is, why did only Christianity develop this systematic association between divinity and whiteness? The answer lies in the unique history of Christianity, its co-optation by Roman imperial power and then its instrumentalization to justify European colonial domination. But imagine if we recovered a truly universal Christian spirituality, a spirituality where God has no race because he embraces all races, where Christ is black to black people, Asian to Asian people, indigenous to indigenous people, not out of relativism, but because the incarnation itself transcends and includes all human diversity. This doesn't mean that God changes his appearance like a chameleon. It means that the image of God is so vast, so inclusive, that each human group can recognize itself in it without diminishing others. It is a theology of divine abundance, not of racial scarcity. And there's a mystical dimension to that. Many mystics throughout history have reported visions where they encountered Christ or sacred figures reflecting their own ethnicity. Saint Joan of Arc saw Jesus as French. Native American mystics reported visions of a Christ with native features. African contemplatives described encounters with a black Jesus. The theological question is, are these visions true? The mystical answer is that they are all true because the divine is vast enough to manifest itself in all these forms. Physical appearance is the veil through which the infinite becomes comprehensible to the finite. But there is an even deeper dimension. If God is truly universal, then our visual representations of God should reflect that universality. This doesn't mean relativism. It means radical inclusiveness. It means religious art that celebrates all human diversity as a manifestation of divine creativity. And this has powerful practical implications. Churches where sacred images reflect the diversity of the congregation, create a very different sense of spiritual belonging. Children who grow up seeing God in their own features develop a spiritual self-confidence that is transformative. We are talking about a spiritual revolution, a revolution that does not destroy faith, but liberates it. That does not diminish God, but amplifies Him. That does not divide humanity, but unifies it in the recognition that we were all made in the image of a God who transcends and includes all our diversity. And perhaps that is precisely the spiritual revolution our world needs right now. A spirituality that heals racial wounds instead of perpetuating them. A faith that liberates instead of oppresses. An image of God that is truly universal, truly inclusive, truly transformative. The final question is personal. How does this revelation change your own relationship with the sacred? How does it transform your understanding of who you are and what your place is in the divine plan? Comment, transformation. If this spiritual perspective is changing how you understand not only God, but your own divine identity. Now I need to pause and speak directly to you, the viewer, because we've reached the most important moment in this investigation, the moment where you need to decide what you're going to do with everything we've discovered. And that decision will determine not only how you see the story, but how you live the rest of your life. Let's be honest. How are you feeling right now? Maybe confusion, because everything you believed in is being questioned. Maybe anger, because you realize you've been deceived your whole life. Maybe excitement, because you're discovering a liberating truth. Or maybe resistance, because it's hard to accept that something so fundamental could be wrong. All of these feelings are valid. They are all normal. And they are all part of a process that billions of people around the world have to face. What happens when we discover that our most basic understanding of reality has been shaped by political agendas we didn't understand? But I'll ask an even deeper question. If you were to discover tomorrow with 100% certainty that Jesus Christ always had African features, what would that change in your life? How would it affect your faith? How would it change the way you see other people? How would it transform your understanding of justice, human value, and divine purpose? For some people, this discovery would be liberating. They could finally see themselves reflected in the divine. They could finally understand that their blackness is not an obstacle to holiness, but a reflection of God's own appearance. They could finally worship without having to deny a fundamental part of who they are. For others, it would be terrifying, because it would mean acknowledging that they participated, even involuntarily, in a system that spiritually marginalized billions of people. It would mean admitting that their spirituality was built on racist premises that they never questioned. But here's the deeper question. What if the color of Jesus' skin isn't really the main point? What if what truly matters is what this revelation teaches us about honesty, about justice, about our willingness to question comfortable truths when they cause suffering to others? Because ultimately, what we're investigating here isn't just religious history. It's a case study of how power shapes truth, how narratives are constructed to serve specific interests, how even our most sacred beliefs can be instrumentalized to justify injustice. And this leads us to an even more uncomfortable question. If we have been deceived about something as fundamental as the appearance of God, about what other things have we been deceived? What other truths that we accept without question are actually political constructs disguised as historical or spiritual facts? This question can be liberating or paralyzing, depending on how you approach it. It can lead to cynicism. If everything is a lie, nothing matters. Or it can lead to wisdom. If some things are lies, I need to learn to distinguish truth from manipulation. But I will propose a third option. What if this revelation doesn't destroy your faith, but purifies it? What if discovering that Jesus was black doesn't diminish his divinity, but makes it more universal? What if recognizing historical manipulation doesn't make us cynical, but more committed to the truth? Think about it. A black Jesus is more radical, more revolutionary, more challenging to the status quo than a white Jesus. A God who chooses to embody the characteristics of the oppressed instead of the oppressors is a more interesting, more courageous, more worthy of worship God than a God who simply confirms existing hierarchies, and a Christianity that recognizes its original diversity, that celebrates its African roots, that embraces all of humanity as equally made in the image of God, that is a more powerful, more transformative Christianity, more faithful to its own gospel than a Christianity that unconsciously perpetuates racial supremacies. But here's the choice you need to make. Will you use this information to become a more conscious, fairer person, more committed to the truth? Or will you use this information to fuel resentment, division, and bitterness? Because truth without love becomes just another form of violence, and love without truth becomes just ineffective sentimentality. What we need is loving truth, truth that liberates, that heals, that transforms. And this means that if you are black and are discovering that you may share physical characteristics with Jesus, your response should not be black supremacy, but gratitude for the dignity that this reveals. And if you are white and are discovering that your representations of Christ may be wrong, your response should not be paralyzing guilt, but a commitment to restorative justice. The point is not to replace one racial hierarchy with another. The point is to recognize that God transcends race precisely because He includes all races. It is to understand that the image of God is so vast that each human group can recognize itself in it without excluding others. And perhaps this is the most important spiritual lesson, that our diversity is not an accident or a flaw in the divine plan, but an expression of God's infinite creativity, that each skin tone, each hair texture, each face shape is a note in the symphony of divine beauty. But this only happens if we choose to see it this way, if we choose to use this revelation to build bridges instead of walls, if we choose to let this truth make us more human, more compassionate, more just. The choice is yours, and that choice will determine whether you leave this video as the same person you entered, or as someone transformed by the courage to face uncomfortable truths and allow those truths to transform you. So tell me, are you ready for this transformation? Are you willing to let this revelation change not only your mind, but your heart? Are you prepared to live according to what you have discovered? Comment, ready, if you are willing to allow this truth to transform your life, and resistance, if you are still struggling to accept these revelations. Now that we've gone through this deep reflection, it's time to talk about what really matters. How will you live differently from today onward? Because knowledge without application is just intellectual entertainment, and the truth we discovered today demands action. Not just a change in thinking, but a transformation of behavior. Let's start with something practical and immediate. How will you educate the children around you? If you are a father, mother, grandfather, grandmother, uncle, aunt, or just someone who interacts with children, you now have a responsibility. These children will grow up in a world where they will still see mostly white representations of Jesus. How will you counterbalance that? The answer isn't simply to replace white images with black images. The answer is to teach that God is so great, so universal, that different cultures see Him in different ways, and that all these ways are valid. It's about showing illustrated books where Jesus appears with different racial characteristics. It's about explaining that the most important thing about Jesus isn't His appearance, but His message of love and justice. But it goes beyond early childhood education. How will you respond when you hear racist jokes that use religious language? When someone talks about washing in water or makes spiritual references that associate whiteness with purity and darkness with sin? Will you remain silent, or will you gently educate them about the historical roots of these associations? And what about your church, if you attend one? How will you react when you see only European religious art on the walls? Will you suggest diversification? Will you gift the church with art that reflects the diversity of the congregation? Will you propose Bible studies on the African origins of Christianity? This doesn't have to be confrontational. It can be educational, gentle, gradual. The goal isn't to create conflict, but to expand awareness. It's about helping people understand that broadening their understanding of God doesn't diminish their faith, it enriches it. Let's talk about an even more practical application. How does this change the way you see and treat people of different races? If you truly embrace the idea that Jesus had African features, it should profoundly affect how you view black people, not as objects of pity or charity, but as people who literally share appearance with the very God you worship. This means examining your unconscious biases. It means questioning why you might feel more comfortable being treated by a white doctor than a black one. It means asking why you might automatically assume competence in some people and doubt others based solely on appearance. And if you are black and you have absorbed this revelation, how does that change your self-esteem, your self-confidence, the way you carry your blackness in the world? It shouldn't lead you to racial arrogance, but to a quiet dignity based on the recognition that you literally carry the image of God. But let's look at more systemic applications. How can you use this information to promote social justice in concrete ways? Perhaps by supporting organizations that work for racial equality. Perhaps by voting for candidates who have genuinely inclusive policies. Perhaps by using your economic or social privilege to amplify marginalized voices. One specific application is in the world of art and culture. If you work in museums, galleries, publishing houses, or any cultural space, you now have knowledge about African Christian artistic traditions that have been systematically ignored. How will you use this information? Will you propose exhibitions? Will you include these perspectives in curatorial work? Will you educate colleagues? And if you are an artist, how does that inspire your own creation? What responsibility do you have to create religious art that reflects real historical diversity instead of perpetuating European stereotypes? How can you use your art to educate and transform consciousness? For educators, the application is obvious but crucial. How will you incorporate this information into history, art, or religious studies curricula? How will you teach about Christianity in a way that includes its African roots and traditions? How will you prepare students to question dominant narratives and seek primary evidence? But perhaps the most important application is personal and spiritual. How does this revelation change your prayers, your meditation, your devotional life? If you usually visualize Jesus during prayer, what image will appear now? How does this affect your sense of divine connection? And how does that change your sense of mission in the world? If Jesus chose to incarnate with characteristics of the marginalized, what does that say about where your priorities should be? How does that influence your career choices, your financial investments, your social activism? A. Specific practical application. Start diversifying your sources of information on spirituality and history. Seek out African, indigenous, and Asian authors. Read Black theologians, non-European historians, and artists from different cultures. Expand your library to include perspectives that have been systematically excluded from mainstream education. How about creating spaces for dialogue? Organize discussions in your community about religious representation. Invite people from different backgrounds to share how they see God. Create opportunities for honest conversations about race and spirituality. But beware of some pitfalls. Don't use this information to fuel white savior complexes. Don't try to save black people by showing that Jesus was black. And don't use it for tokenism, superficially including one or two black images to appear progressive without actually examining deeper systems. Real-world application requires humility, consistency, and long-term commitment. It requires a willingness to be corrected when you're wrong. It requires recognizing that learning about racial justice is a lifelong process, not a final destination. And remember, you don't have to do everything at once. Start small. Choose an application that resonates with you and genuinely commit to it. It could be early childhood education. It could be art. It could be activism. It could be personal spiritual growth. The important thing is to start, because ultimately, truth without application is just interesting trivia. But truth applied with love and consistency can literally change the world. And if billions of people apply these revelations in practical and loving ways, we can finally begin to heal some of humanity's deepest racial wounds. The question isn't whether you can make a difference. The question is, will you? Comment on a specific application you will implement in your life after watching this video. Be specific, be practical, be courageous. Now let's broaden our perspective and see how this issue manifests itself around the world. Because what we've discovered about the manipulation of Christian images is not an isolated phenomenon. It's part of a global pattern of how European colonization attempted to rewrite not only political history, but the very spirituality of humanity. Let's start with Ethiopia, which I've already mentioned, but which deserves a deeper analysis. Ethiopia is one of the oldest Christian countries in the world, officially Christian since 330 AD, decades before many European countries. And for over 1,600 years, it developed a Christian artistic tradition completely independent of European influence. And guess how all the saints, angels, and Jesus himself are portrayed? As black people. Not as cultural adaptation, but as a preservation of original traditions. What is fascinating is that when European missionaries arrived in Ethiopia in the 15th and 16th centuries, they found a Christianity that was older, more erudite, and more sophisticated than many European traditions. The Ethiopians possessed biblical manuscripts in original languages that the Europeans didn't even know. They had theological traditions that resolved issues that still divided Europe. But instead of humility and learning, the European response was racial horror. How could these Africans have a deeper Christianity than theirs? How could they represent Christ as black and still demonstrate superior theological scholarship? The response was to try to correct Ethiopian Christianity, to force it to conform to European standards. The same dynamic occurred in Coptic Egypt. Coptic Christians trace their origins directly to the evangelist Mark, making them one of the oldest Christian communities in the world. And for centuries, they developed a religious art where Christ and the saints are depicted with typically Middle Eastern and African features. But when European powers colonized Egypt, there was a systematic attempt to westernize Coptic Christianity. European scholars corrected Coptic theological texts. European artists restored ancient icons by making them lighter. European missionaries established schools that taught proper Christian art. Let's go to Mexico and Latin America. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived, they encountered indigenous traditions that, while not Christian, had sophisticated spiritual concepts of the divine. The response was not dialogue, but destruction. Thousands of indigenous codices were burned. Temples were demolished. And when Christianity was imposed, it came with a European iconography that deliberately contrasted with indigenous representations of the sacred. But something interesting happened. Indigenous communities secretly began creating Christian art that incorporated indigenous characteristics. The famous Virgin of Guadalupe, for example, has features that scholars recognize as being specifically designed to speak to indigenous sensibilities: dark skin, non-European features, symbolism that incorporates pre-Columbian traditions. The Iglesia Católica initially resisted these indigenous representations, but eventually accepted them when realized they were powerful tools for conversion. However, this acceptance came with a crucial caveat. These could be local adaptations, but the universal representations remained European. In Asia, we find similar patterns. Christianity arrived in China in the 7th century, brought by Nestorian missionaries who came from the Middle East, not Europe. And the earliest Chinese Christian representations showed Jesus and biblical figures with Asian features. This wasn't cultural adaptation. It was a natural interpretation by people who understood Jesus to be universal. But when European missionaries arrived in the 16th century, they were horrified by these incorrect representations. Portuguese and Spanish Jesuits systematically destroyed Chinese Christian art that didn't conform to European standards. They established art schools that taught Chinese artists to paint Jesus as European, not Asian. The same pattern repeated in Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Vietnam. Everywhere European colonialism encountered indigenous Christianity or indigenous interpretations of Christianity, the response was the same: destroy, correct, Europeanize. But here's what's fascinating. In places where European influence was minimal or where communities successfully resisted cultural colonization, we find Christian traditions that preserved more diverse representations of the divine. Ethiopian Christianity, Indian Syrian Christianity, some isolated Chinese Christian communities, all maintain traditions where Jesus is depicted with local characteristics, and these communities don't see this as compromise or adaptation. They see it as faithfulness to the universal nature of the Christian message. They understand that if God became human for all humanity, then all humanity should be able to see themselves reflected in that incarnation. But the most interesting case study is Brazil. Brazil received millions of enslaved Africans who brought with them rich spiritual traditions. When forced to convert to Christianity, they didn't abandon their spiritual insights. They found ways to incorporate them into Christian practice. They created a syncretic Christianity where African spiritual wisdom enhanced rather than contradicted Christian theology. And what's remarkable is that this African-influenced Brazilian Christianity often produced more vibrant, more joyful, more community-centered expressions of faith than European-influenced Christianity. Communities that embraced their African spiritual heritage created forms of Christian worship that were more embodied, more musical, more celebratory. Today, some of the fastest-growing Christian movements in the world are in Africa and Asia, and these movements are naturally developing representations of Christ and Christian community that reflect local cultures rather than European models. They're not trying to be controversial, they're just being authentic. The Korean concept of Minjung theology emphasizes Jesus as the defender of oppressed peoples. African theological movements like Ubuntu Christianity integrate traditional African concepts of community and interconnectedness. Asian Christians develop understandings of Jesus that incorporate insights from Buddhist and Hindu contemplative traditions. What we're witnessing globally is a decolonization of Christianity. Communities around the world are reclaiming their right to encounter the divine in forms that speak to their cultural souls, while remaining faithful to the essential Christian message of love, justice, and redemption. And this isn't theological relativism. These communities aren't saying Jesus changes depending on culture. They're saying Jesus is so universal, so transcendent, that every culture can find authentic ways to encounter and represent him. The question for those of us in Western contexts is, are we willing to learn from these global perspectives? Are we humble enough to recognize that our European-influenced Christianity might be culturally limited rather than universally normative? Because the future of Christianity is global, diverse, multifaceted. The future belongs to communities that can embrace the full range of human diversity as reflection of divine creativity. The future belongs to forms of faith that liberate rather than colonize, that include rather than exclude, that celebrate the image of God in every human face. Comment, global. If you are inspired by the diversity of Christian expressions around the world and want to learn more about these non-European traditions, we've reached the end of our journey, and now it's time to talk about what truly matters, how this revelation can transform not only your individual life, but our society as a whole. Because what we've discovered today isn't just historical correction. It's an opportunity for collective healing that humanity has been waiting for centuries. Let's start by thinking about the impact this transformation could have on future generations. Imagine children growing up in a world where they see God represented in all his human diversity. Imagine what that would do for global self-esteem, for reducing racism, for building a truly egalitarian society. Studies in child development show that children who grow up seeing positive and diverse representations of authority figures, including spiritual figures, develop greater self-confidence, greater interracial empathy, and a lower propensity for prejudice. Now imagine this applied on a global scale, with billions of children growing up with a more inclusive understanding of the divine. But let's go beyond the children. Think about the impact this can have on healing historical traumas. Communities that have been systematically marginalized for centuries, that have internalized feelings of spiritual inferiority, that have been taught that their appearance was inconsistent with holiness. Imagine the transformative power of discovering that they were always perfectly made in God's image. This is not just symbolism. Racial trauma is real trauma, with measurable psychological effects that are passed down through generations. And spiritual healing is real healing, with documented power to transform not just individuals, but entire communities. Now let's talk about the impact this can have on religion itself. A Christianity that embraces its original diversity, that celebrates its African roots, that recognizes its true universality, that is a Christianity that is more attractive to an increasingly diverse world. It is a Christianity that can genuinely speak to all cultures without colonizing them. And this has enormous practical implications. Churches that embrace this diversity will attract more diverse congregations. Seminaries that teach this more complete history will produce more conscious leaders. Christian organizations that incorporate these perspectives will be more effective in serving marginalized communities. But the impact goes far beyond religion. Let's talk about art and culture. Imagine an artistic renaissance where artists of all races feel free to create authentic representations of the divine. Imagine museums that celebrate the true historical diversity of religious art. Imagine an entertainment industry that produces films and books where biblical figures are portrayed with accurate historical diversity. This would create not only greater cultural accuracy, but also greater aesthetic richness. European Renaissance art is beautiful, but imagine the beauty that could emerge when African, Asian, indigenous, and mixed-race artists felt equally empowered to interpret sacred themes through their own cultural lenses. And let's talk about the educational impact. Educational systems that teach a more complete and accurate history of Christianity will produce more conscious, more critical citizens, more capable of questioning dominant narratives. They will form people who know how to distinguish between authentic faith and political manipulation. This has implications for democracy. Citizens who have learned to question a dominant religious narrative are better able to question other political and social narratives that may be serving hidden agendas. A more consciously critical population is a more democratic population. But perhaps the most important impact is on social justice. Because recognizing a Black Jesus is not just theological correction. It is an act of restorative justice for billions of people who have been spiritually disenfranchised. It is returning dignity that was stolen, restoring identity that was suppressed, healing wounds that have festered for centuries, and this individual healing becomes social transformation. People who feel truly valued by God become more confident in demanding fair treatment in society. Communities that recognize their divine dignity become more able to resist oppression and fight for their rights. Let's be specific about how you can be part of this transformation. First, commit to continuous education. This video is just the beginning. Seek out books, articles, and documentaries that explore these issues in greater depth. Become a genuinely informed person about these issues. Segundo, use sua influencia, whatever size it is, to spread accurate information. Share this knowledge with friends, family, colleagues. Post about it responsibly on social media. Incorporate it into conversations where appropriate. Become an educator in your own circles. Tercero, support organizations and individuals who are doing this work. There are scholars, artists, activists, and spiritual leaders who have been researching and promoting these perspectives for years. Find them, support them, amplify their voices. Quarto, examine and transform your own biases. Use this knowledge as a starting point for deeper self-reflection about race, privilege, and spiritual assumptions. Allow this revelation to change not just your mind, but your heart. Quinto, if you're in a position of influence, as a parent, teacher, pastor, artist, business leader, use that position to promote more inclusive and accurate representations. Create change in the systems you have access to. But remember, transformation takes time. Social change is measured in decades, not days. Spiritual healing happens across generations, not just in individuals. Be patient with the process while remaining committed to the goal, and be prepared for resistance. People who have built their identity around exclusive religious narratives will fight to preserve those narratives. Institutions that have benefited from racial hierarchies will resist challenges to those hierarchies. Your commitment to truth and justice needs to be stronger than their commitment to comfortable lies. But also remember that you're not alone. Around the world, millions of people are awakening to these same truths. You're part of a global movement toward greater spiritual authenticity, greater historical accuracy, greater social justice. Your individual transformation is part of a collective transformation that can heal some of humanity's deepest wounds. The ultimate question is not whether this transformation will happen. It's already happening. The question is whether you'll be part of it. Whether you'll use your life to advance truth and justice, or whether you'll remain passive while others do the hard work of change. The choice is yours, and that choice will determine not just your own spiritual journey, but your contribution to the healing of the world. Comment: committed transformation. If you are ready to dedicate part of your life to promoting these truths in a loving, persistent, and transformative way. We've reached the end of this revolutionary journey, but in truth, this is only the beginning. If you've watched this far, you've demonstrated the courage to question fundamental assumptions, the wisdom to seek truth even when it's uncomfortable, and the openness to allow that truth to transform you. But watching is not enough. Knowledge without action is just entertainment. The question now is, what will you do with what you've learned? First, if this content opened your eyes, if it challenged your assumptions, if it gave you hope or inspired you to think differently, hit that like button. Not for the algorithm, but as a declaration that you value truth over comfort, growth over stagnation, justice over convenient lies. Second, subscribe and hit the notification bell, because this conversation is far from over. There are more hidden truths to uncover, more historical narratives to examine, more opportunities for transformation ahead, and you don't want to miss any of it. But most importantly, leave a comment telling me how this information is going to change how you live. Are you going to educate your children differently? Are you going to question other historical narratives? Are you going to become an advocate for more inclusive representation? Are you going to deepen your own spiritual journey? Be specific, be honest, be bold, because your commitment in the comments is not just for me, it's for you. It's your public declaration of what kind of person you choose to become after this revelation. And if you know someone, a friend, family member, colleague, spiritual leader, who needs to hear this information, share this video with them, not to create conflict, but to create consciousness, not to destroy faith, but to purify it, not to divide, but to unite humanity under a more authentic understanding of our shared divine image. Remember, every great transformation in history started with individuals who had the courage to speak uncomfortable truths with love. You have the opportunity to be one of those individuals, to be part of the generation that heals ancient wounds and builds a more just and spiritually authentic world. The truth you've discovered today is not meant to stay hidden. It's meant to spread, to grow, to transform communities and cultures, and maybe even civilization itself. But that only happens if people like you have the courage to share it, to live it, to embody it. So I ask you one final time, will you be part of this transformation? Will you allow what you've learned to change not just how you think, but how you live? Will you help others discover these same liberating truths? The answer you give to those questions will determine not just your own spiritual journey, but your contribution to the healing of our world. And based on your courage to watch this entire video, based on your openness to question everything you thought you knew, I believe your answer will be yes. Welcome to the transformation. Welcome to the truth. Welcome to a more authentic and liberating understanding of the divine. Now go change the world.